Welcome to a deep dive that might just fundamentally shift how you think about one of history's most iconic periods, the Viking Age.
Yeah, you probably picture, the horned helmets, the endless pillaging.
Right. But what if the true story is, well, far more complex? Driven by motivations that are surprisingly relatable.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're going to unpack the insightful work of historical novelist Bjørn Andreas Bull-Hansen, specifically his article, Why Did the Viking Age Start?
And he really challenges us, doesn't he, to look beyond those surface-level explanations.
He does, digging into the political, the religious, the economic layers of early medieval Europe. It's fascinating stuff.
So our mission today really is to try and discover some surprising answers to that question. Not just what happened, but maybe why it mattered.
Exactly. Connecting those ancient events to, deeper human drives freedom, prosperity, self-determination, things we still grapple with.
Okay, let's jump in. Bull-Hansen hits us right away with a compelling reason for those first raids.
Yeah, it's almost blunt, isn't it? He says the Norse simply could do it.
Right. And that sounds simple, but it's profound. This wasn't just random luck.
No, not at all.
The source really focuses on their distinct advantages, especially their maritime technology.
The longships.
The longships. Unbelievable technology for the time. Shallow drafts, clinker-built hulls. They weren't just fast.
You could go anywhere, right?
Pretty much. Open ocean, shallow rivers inland, true amphibious vessels, like you said. That meant they could strike far from the coast, where defenses were weakest.
Just wiki.
Very. And couple that with their combat techniques, often unpredictable, maybe more advanced than what people expected.
So that combination, the tech and the tactics, it just gave them this capacity, this power to raid effectively.
Exactly. An unparalleled ability to project power suddenly appeared on the scene.
So how does that initial spark, that, technological and tactical edge, change how we should think about power back then? It wasn't just about kings and land anymore.
Well, that's where it gets even more interesting. Bull-Hansen argues it wasn't just about capability or even simple greed. He frames it as potentially a profound response to external pressures, things happening to them.
Right, and he points to a really brutal event to illustrate this, Charlemagne's massacre of the Saxons in 782.
Yeah, that's a horrific moment. Around 4,500 Saxons supposedly beheaded. Why? For resisting forced conversion to Christianity.
It's staggering, not just warfare, but religious and political coercion on a massive scale, designed to crush resistance and send a message.
A terrifying message. And according to the source, this act sent shockwaves through the region, especially northwards. It provoked what Bull-Hansen suggests were defensive reactions from the Norse.
Defensive reactions, meaning the raids?
Possibly. The article posits that maybe, just maybe, some early Viking raids started as direct retaliation. A pushback against what they saw as Christian imperialism.
So not a peaceful religion spreading, but an invasive, coercive force coming their way.
From their perspective, potentially, yes.
And to underline that tension, the source mentions King Godfred of Denmark. He built a huge defensive wall, the Danevirke, across his southern border.
Right, clearly anticipating trouble from the Franks. That's not just a reaction. It's serious strategic defense against a perceived existential threat.
So with all this tension building, this fear and maybe resentment, it leads us to Lindisfarne, doesn't it? 793.
The infamous raid. Usually marked as the official start of the Viking Age, often just painted as, mindless plunder, monks, monasteries, gold.
But the source suggests we should look deeper, that there might have been a symbolic element too.
Precisely. Plunder was definitely a factor, let's be clear. But Bull-Hansen argues it might also have symbolized a defiant strike against that encroaching Christian expansionism.
A statement.
A very violent statement. And get this, the source mentions the Norse apparently had a nickname for Charlemagne, Karl the Slaughterer.
Wow. That certainly captures the bitterness, the resentment, doesn't it?
It really does. And it makes you wonder, how often do we miss the full picture in history by just focusing on the most obvious motive, like greed, or by only hearing one side of the story?
That's a really powerful point. It challenges that simple narrative. But okay, history rarely stays simple. What started as maybe defiance or retaliation, it changed, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It evolved. While those initial raids might have had that retaliatory or defensive edge, things shifted. It became more systematic.
How so?
It transitioned into what Bull-Hansen calls a pragmatic economy of plunder. It wasn't just sporadic anymore.
An economy of plunder, what does that mean in practice?
Well, think about Norse society. Warriors, leaders, they needed wealth. Gold, silver, yes, but also cattle, land, and crucially slaves.
Slaves were a big part of it.
A huge part, according to the source. Wealth was needed to pay followers, to maintain political power, to show status. It was vital for social mobility. You gained loyalty and influence through the wealth you could distribute.
And slaves were a key commodity in that wealth system.
Absolutely. The source explicitly mentions the grim but integral role of the slave trade, sometimes involving North African traders. It was a dark but apparently significant engine for their economy.
And could people move up in society through this?
That's another striking point the source makes. Even freed slaves, it seems, could potentially improve their standing by joining raids, acquiring their own wealth. A brutal form of social mobility, but mobility nonetheless.
So it transformed from maybe resistance to this sophisticated, if brutal, economic engine fueling their society and expansion.
Exactly. It became self-perpetuating, in a way.
But we need to be careful not to paint everyone with the same brush, right? It wasn't all raids and plunder all the time.
No, definitely not. And that's a crucial point the source emphasizes. If we broaden our view, we see not all Norse expeditions were violent. That's a common stereotype Bull-Hansen pushes back against.
Because many Norse people were just looking for a better life, like settlers.
Precisely. Land in Scandinavia was becoming scarce, partly due to population growth. So many sought better living conditions elsewhere. They packed up their families, their tools, their livestock, and they settled, often peacefully.
Looking for opportunity, not just conflict.
Exactly. Bull-Hansen actually likens these settlers to pioneers, searching for independence, prosperity, a new start. Much like migrations later in history, like Europeans going to the Americas.
And they went far, didn't they? Not just raiding England.
Oh, incredibly far. Iceland, Greenland, even reaching North America of inland. That demonstrates ambition far beyond just pillaging nearby coasts.
It really recontextualizes them. Not just monsters, but also farmers, traders, explorers, families, driven by very human desires.
It has necessary complexity, I think.
Okay, so we've seen this evolution, capacity, retaliation, a plunder economy, peaceful settlement. It's a complex picture. So how did this incredible period, the Viking Age, actually end? Did they just fade away, get defeated?
Well, here's maybe the most surprising twist in Bull-Hansen's analysis. He proposes something really counterintuitive.
Go on.
He argues it didn't really end in defeat. It ended because they won.
They won. What does that mean? Won what?
Think about it. What's the ultimate symbol of their success he points to? King Cnut, or Cnut of Denmark.
Becoming King of England.
King of England. And Norway and Denmark, the North Sea Empire. That's not losing. That's reaching the pinnacle of political and territorial power in Northern Europe.
So the argument is, once they achieved that level of dominance.
Exactly. In Bull-Hansen's words, it ended because they won. Once Norse rulers, or those of Norse descent, held crowns, established powerful kingdoms like in England, or Normandy in France, or Sicily, that systematic raiding wasn't the main game anymore.
Dominance replaced resistance. Control replaced plunder.
Pretty much. They controlled their own productive lands, their own trade networks. The need for external plunder, that sort of raiding economy, it largely faded because they had integrated, they'd conquered, they'd become the establishment in many places.
That is a fascinating way to frame the end. Not decline, but absorption through success.
It really turns the typical narrative on its head, doesn't it?
It does. Now, before we wrap up, there's one last important point, a linguistic one the source makes, which helps us understand the diversity here.
Yes. The term Viking itself.
Right. We use it all the time, but it wasn't originally a label for all Norse people, was it?
No. According to the source, it was more specific. It referred to an activity, really seafaring, trading, sometimes raiding, going a Viking. It wasn't an ethnic label for everyone from Scandinavia.
So while the article uses Viking broadly, probably for accessibility, it's a good reminder.
It is. We should think of Norse culture as this wide, diverse society. Farmers, artisans, lawmakers, poets, traders, families, living lives often quite separate from the raiding expeditions we focus on. Not everyone was a Viking in that specific active sense.
That's a crucial clarification. Okay, what a deep dive this has been. We've really tried to unpack the Viking Age.
Moving beyond just, the simple stories of plunder.
Right. Exploring this complex tapestry, technological prowess, that potential retaliation against perceived imperialism, the evolution into a brutal but sophisticated economy, the peaceful migrations.
And then that surprising end triumph leading to integration.
It really shows how much our understanding of history depends on perspective, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The story of the Vikings, seen through this lens Bull-Hansen provides, it really challenges us, I think, to look for motivations beyond the obvious, to always ask why behind the what.
So, thinking about all this, here's something for you, the listener, to consider. What does this mean for your understanding of history?
Hmm.
If the Vikings weren't just simple raiders, but a complex people driven by these deeply human desires, freedom, land, security, opportunity, even reaction against perceived threats, how might that change how you view other historical events?
Or even conflicts and dynamics happening today.
Exactly. Perhaps the most important battles aren't always the ones fought with swords and axes. Maybe they're fought with ideas, with perspectives, and how we choose to understand the past and the other. Something to think about.